Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for those who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of your life. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. The single biggest life event that can absolutely destroy everything that you've built and worked for as a man is going through a divorce. And I know how painful this can be because I went through mine 5 years ago. Soon after getting married, I launched my most successful business ever. I bought a family house and I started building my investment portfolio. And just 18 months later, we separated and I'd lost half of everything. Well, that happened because I was naive. I thought it wouldn't happen to me and that getting a prenuptial agreement was planning to fail from the start. Well, over the last year, I've had several of my friends take their first journey down the path of marriage, and many of them asked for advice. And the advice that I gave them was simple. You wouldn't start a new company with a business partner without an ownership and operating agreement in place, especially if it required you to put 100% of your assets on the table from the day you started that company. So why in the world would you get married without a prenuptial agreement? Well, today we're going to have a very candid talk with divorce attorney Alyssa Rower. Now, I realize this can be an uncomfortable topic to discuss with your significant other, but as you're going to hear today, going into a marriage with a prenup is the only way to have a safe and healthy relationship for both parties, no matter what happens. Alyssa will bring you up to speed on marital law. We're going to dive into the costs, considerations, and the healthy way to bring up the topic with your spouse-to-be. If you plan to get married in the future, this will be the most valuable podcast episode you will ever listen to. And I can say that with the kind of confidence that only real-world experience can provide. Please help me welcome Alyssa Rower. Well, Alyssa Rower, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today to talk about a topic that we have yet to cover on the podcast over the past 2 years, but that is unbelievably important for most of the people listening. So thanks so much for the time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Absolutely. So the goal for today is to talk about marriage and divorce and to ideally give everybody listening, really some sage advice on how to approach those two things responsibly and in a way that can ensure the best possible outcome no matter what happens. And if you're new to the show or my story, I got married around the age of 31, 32 and went through a divorce very quickly within 24 months, or at least separated and filed within 24 months. And that was the most expensive 24 months I've ever gone through in my life. So I definitely went about it the wrong way. I made all of the typical mistakes. And so I'm really excited to have you here today because I think this episode is going to potentially save hundreds of, if not thousands of people some real heartache.
Well, thanks for having me. And that's certainly my hope in educating people about what they should know about divorce law before they get married, if they're happily married, or if they're headed toward a separation. I think just having some knowledge about the area, as you said, can save you thousands of dollars and a lot of turmoil.
Absolutely. Well, let's just kind of dive into the beginning of the process, right? Let's assume that somebody is interested in getting married. Maybe they've just proposed. And I would love it if we could go through these examples, assuming the individual, the man or the woman, is an entrepreneur.
Sure.
And either they have an existing business that they're bringing to the table, or what does the scenario look like if they start a business after they get married, right? Take us through the whole marriage, prenuptial legality side of this endeavor.
Absolutely. And a caveat before I get into the substance is that I'm a New York divorce lawyer. Divorce is very state specific and it's controlled obviously by state law. So I can speak to New York law, but for your listeners out there who live in other states, then they should speak to a divorce lawyer, a matrimonial lawyer in that state. I just want to make that clear so nobody takes what I'm saying to mean that's the law in their state.
Yeah, I know Texas is different than most.
Texas is different, and that's what's part of the crazy thing about divorce law, is that it does vary so much. And we can touch on that a bit when we talk about prenuptial agreements. So for those who don't know, a prenuptial agreement is something you enter into prior to your wedding date, where you talk about what's going to happen in the event of a divorce or in the event of death. Those are the two ways that your marriage will end. And morbidly, you hope that your marriage ends in death. But a lot of marriages still end in divorce. So what a prenuptial agreement can do is protect against that. I really view it as an insurance policy in that, still about 40 to 50% of marriages end, and nobody wants to be in that camp. But if you are, it can save you a lot of trouble on the back end. Prenups are not just for the super wealthy. I think that's a common misconception, but really for entrepreneurs and professionals with their act together who really want to make smart decisions. And I'm seeing more and more of that in my practice of people who don't necessarily have a ton of money, but want to go in and make some smart decisions.
Now, what advice would you give to those who are listening who are afraid to bring up the topic of a prenup with their, spouse-to-be, essentially? They're afraid that it's going to cause some drama or, even potentially end the relationship, or it's going to turn it into something that feels like a business arrangement rather than, love, essentially. I know it's a hard topic I know it was for me when I was going through that, at a younger age.
It is a really hard topic, and it is a really difficult thing to bring up. It's not the most romantic. So my advice is, 1, do it early. You don't want to be negotiating your prenup at the same time that you're writing your wedding vows. That's just way too much cognitive dissonance. Second, if you need to talk to a couples counselor about it in an environment where you feel safe and like you can bring those things up, that's a great idea. And third, make it more about this is an insurance policy. This has nothing to do with how I feel about our love. I hope we never use this, but I've heard enough horror stories to know that if God forbid we get a divorce, if you leave me, for example, then I don't want to have a miserable divorce. And I think that a very important thing to say in that conversation is that I want us to make decisions about these things while we're in love and happy, because I don't want to be in a situation where something is broken down and the things that how we wanted to treat each other is no longer at the forefront, and instead we're just angry. And then we do things from a place of emotion as a place to of what we intended our lives to be together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Having gone through this, I can just tell folks who are listening right now, if you're thinking about getting married and you don't get a prenup, you are absolutely crazy, because there's no good that comes from not having it, but there's a ton of good that comes from going through that process. And it's just like you said, especially if, during the marriage, you guys have kids and now you've got kids involved, and the entire goal is to allow you to go through that process with as little drama and animosity and anger as possible. And the only way to do that is to agree to what that, dissolution looks like, before you get there, as you just talked about.
Especially for business owners. And I think that's one category that people don't think about. It also applies to aspiring business owners. Prenups do not need to cover just what you have when you get married. You can, if you're somebody who's in a cubicle, but you have the dreams of having the next Uber business, your prenup can cover that, even if you're in the cubicle for the rest of your life. Hopefully not. So it can cover the gamut of assets that you acquire during your marriage. So for example, if you want me to dive into sort of the business owner situation that is a little bit scary, I'm happy to.
Yeah, no, let's do that.
So in the vast majority of states, a business that you create during a marriage is marital or community property. Moreover, if you have a business as of the date of your marriage and you still have it at the time of divorce, any increase in value of that business is marital or community property. So what that means in practical terms is if I get divorced, I'm a business owner, for example, my spouse would have the right to say, okay, we need to value your business. If we can't agree on an expert to value that business, we would each get our own expert. To value the business, you then need to send the expert all sorts of financial documents and answer all sorts of questions. And the expert is going to delve into whether you should have written off certain things. Was that appropriate? Was that not appropriate? It is very invasive. It is very time consuming. And of course, it takes you away from actually running your business and making sure your business is profitable. After that happens and you either have one valuation or you have two valuations, then you need to agree on what is the value. And if you can't agree, a court who has a lot less experience in your business will choose which value it has if you have a situation where you have two separate experts to decide on that value. After that, you need to decide what's the fair share of the business for the other person. So a common misconception is that your spouse would then have a direct ownership interest in your business. In New York State, that's absolutely not the case. If my business is valued at $1 million, a court might say that my spouse, my husband, should get 30% of that. So I then need to give him $300,000, which obviously can be very problematic if you're not very liquid, or if all of your assets are tied up in the business, or, for example, in your house. So that might mean that I get to keep going to work every day and my husband gets to keep our apartment, for example. So with a prenup, it's not that you can do anything you want to do. And you don't need to only say, okay, I keep my business and my spouse gets nothing in return. But you can creatively decide, A, how are you going to value the business to streamline the process? Or B, say, we're leaving the business outside of the marital pot, but in exchange, I'm going to give my husband the home, the example I just said, but I do that and I don't have to go through the whole valuation and the whole fight. Or C, you can say something like, if I ever choose to sell the business, even if it's after the divorce, then my spouse is going to get X percentage of that business. Does that make sense, Mike? I know it's a bit dense talking about the valuation process.
Yeah, well, the scary scenario for me is, my businesses in the past have not been incredibly stable. Online businesses can do really well one year, and then Facebook or Google can change an algorithm and your revenue can drop 80% in a month, right? So the nightmare scenario is that you go through that, you have your business valuation done, you come to an agreement on what the other person gets. Let's say it's, $300,000, they're entitled to that. And all of a sudden, 2 months later, your business drops by 80% and you can barely pay your own bills, let alone this $15,000 a month payment that you have to, now get stuck with, essentially. Not to mention the fact that your business is no longer worth $1 million or whatever it was when you signed the agreement. It's now worth, a couple $100,000, maybe $150,000. So what do you do in that case, right?
That's exactly right, Mike. And that's why it's really important for business owners or aspiring business owners to have a prenup. Because once you are in court potentially or in the traditional divorce scenario, there's not much you can do to deviate from that unless your spouse agrees. And many people don't agree. And that's what I was talking about, deciding what you want to do when your marriage is healthy. Instead of now your spouse has gone to a divorce lawyer to say, hey, you can get the house and you can get $300,000, move forward with this valuation. And you're angry because your relationship has broken down. So you're in a much different space. So it can be a very scary process. And one thing for tech types of businesses that I do recommend is more potentially of an if, as, and when approach. Meaning you might have decided if you had a prenup that, if this is a business that's part of our partnership that we've both worked on, even if your wife didn't work on it directly, she was maybe doing other things so that you could work on the startup. But it's scary to value it and give her money for a business that could totally fail. But on the other hand, if you're bought by a Facebook or become the next Uber, then she should absolutely get something like that. So in a prenup, you could decide that if the business is ever sold, if a piece of it is sold, at that point, you will get paid out so that it's really a win-win for both of you. The purpose of prenups is not to hurt the other side, and it's not to make something that's one-sided or that feels unfair. It's to come up with something that feels right for both of you when you're happy and in love, and you can really talk through those scenarios.
Yeah, I think it's to limit your potential exposure and risk, right? It's to put some kind of cap on it or box around it where you're like, okay, this is reasonable, and no matter what happens, we'll be able to, make this work for both of us in a reasonable way. What are some of the typical scenarios that you see most often? I know I've had conversations with friends who are thinking about getting married, and they're like, well, what if we're married for 10 or 15 years and she stayed home and helped really raise the kids and supported me in building the business and things like that. And then we end up getting a divorce. And, is there like a scenario where you would give your other half a fixed amount per year that you were married, essentially? Have you seen that?
Yes, that's very common, and it's very simple. So another scenario, if you don't want to deal with valuing your business and worrying about that and the problems that can create that I just talked about, is to say, the business is going to be my separate property. No matter what happens, we're not going to value it. We're not going to do an if, as, and when. But in exchange for that, and to recognize your contributions for either every year of the marriage or for every year that the business is in place, if we get divorced, you will be entitled to X dollars for every year of the marriage. So let's say $100,000 for every year of the marriage. And if you're married for 10 years, then you pay $1 million. The problem with that is, under the scenario that we talked about before, which was the business is valued at $1 million and you owe $300,000, and maybe you're not in a situation to pay that, the distributive award scenario, which is where you pay X dollars for every year of the marriage, has the same downfalls. So a prenup really involves, it's a bespoke document that really is crafted for each couple in terms of what makes sense in their life situation. I mean, I'm happy to give you my example of what my husband and I have done, for example.
Yeah, well, that's what I think would be really helpful is, what's a example that you think would fit nicely for the average scenario?
Well, so every business is different. So obviously a tech startup is very different from a professional services firm, which is what I have. So it's a law firm. I'm never going to sell it to anyone. I can't have my husband be an actual partner in it because he's not a lawyer. And it's much more of a steady business as opposed to something that could be worth zero or could be worth $10 billion, right? So when you're talking about valuing a law firm, for example, it's different than other kinds of businesses. And I think that's what makes this field so interesting, is that every business is different. And therefore, every prenup dealing with every business is different. So what we decided, which felt really fair to us, is my husband he does all the tech for my business. He's a tech guy. I'm obviously a lawyer. So he has helped both directly and then indirectly, in that we have 2 little kids. And he definitely took more of the responsibility with that while I was trying to build the business. And as anyone knows, it's hard to have 2 parents with intense careers. So he's definitely been the one who's there when the kids are sick and everything else. So in recognition, of course, for his contributions both directly to the business and then both indirectly at home to enable me to spend more time working and building this, we decided that he absolutely should get a piece of the business if, God forbid, we get divorced, which hopefully we don't. But he gets it that he doesn't want to have to deal with evaluation at the time. So what we did is come up with a proxy, which means that we're not going to hire valuation experts if we're going to get divorced. Instead, what we would do is basically take, what did I make prior to starting my business? And then what did I make in the 3 years leading up to the divorce? So all it involves is really just looking at the tax return and then subtract out the taxes, and then multiply that by 3. So not to get into the specifics of the formula, but what we did is to say, instead of hiring experts, producing all of our audited financial statements, delving into the expenses, let's just keep this really simple and say, here's a proxy for what it would be worth. It's, if we went through the whole formula, we went through the whole valuation, maybe it would be more, maybe it would be less, but this feels fair to both of us. And whatever that number is, then I pay him X% of that, and it changes depending on the length of our marriage. So that felt like a fair way of saying, I'm acknowledging your contributions, which have been amazing, but we also don't want to have to go through a divorce with lots of expensive experts and fights about that. So let's do sort of a back of the envelope and figure out what it's worth, and then also figure out a payment plan so that I don't have to give him, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars all at once.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Talking to the guys out there who are, let's just say the primary breadwinners, right? And you're going through this. One of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten from a friend around how you frame getting a prenup with your soon-to-be spouse is that you really make it about security. Because I think if somebody is not the career side of the household, and then now they're faced with getting divorced, they don't have a career, they don't have a source of income, they don't have anything, there's a ton of fear that scenario brings up, right? And so so framing the prenup as, hey, if that ever happens, I want you to feel completely secure that you're going to be taken care of, right now from day one before we even get married. And I think framing it that way rather than, hey, I want to make sure I protect what's mine in case we ever get divorced and we turn into opposing sides is a much healthier way to present that process, if you will. So,
absolutely. And I'm a big fan of prenups that are very fair. I don't represent people who tell me they want a prenup that completely hurts the other side. It's just not what I do. I don't believe in it.
Yeah.
And I think if you go into it with, hey, I'm scared that if, God forbid, we get divorced, it's going to last 3 years and crush my business. And you're scared that, if you leave your career and then we get divorced, that you're not going to have any money. So let's try to come up with something now while we're in love and we're happy that allays both of our concerns and makes us both feel okay. And if you frame it like that, I don't see how anyone in 2018 could really oppose that. Because you're not saying you're going to get divorced. It's just, let's protect against the worst. And hopefully we put it in a drawer and we never look at it again.
Now, what does this process look like if you want to go through it, right? Do each of you have to go get your own attorneys, or do you go together and get one attorney that will help you formulate it? How does that work?
So you each do need your own attorney. Again, every state's law is different. New York, by the statute, all you need is to sign a document with a special acknowledgement by a notary. But any good divorce lawyer in New York will tell you that you should each have your own attorneys, that you should each have full financial disclosure to make sure everybody knows what everybody has at the time of the marriage, and that it's not so one-sided. Because in addition to not being notarized right, which is a reason to just throw the agreement out entirely, people do challenge agreements if they say that it was procured by fraud or under duress, or that it was so one-sided. So if you're doing a prenup, you want to do it right. And doing it right means you're both getting representation, you're both getting educated about what the law is if you don't have a prenup and what you're potentially giving up or gaining with a prenup, and making sure you know completely what the other person has and that he or she has answered any questions you have about the business or maybe any trust interests that you have or anything that you have. And certainly that's how I approach every prenup. And I wouldn't represent both sides. Ethically, I would not do that. And I certainly recommend that if I'm representing somebody, they absolutely should have an attorney on the other side.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And I know this is going to vary greatly depending upon what your attorney charges, but what do you think it would typically cost on average to set up a prenup?
That's a good question, Mike. And it so varies by where you are in the country. I mean, my office is in Manhattan, and we're very expensive. I mean, it's one of the most expensive places to live. So I charge a flat rate for my prenups, and it varies depending on the complexity. But probably if you're spending between both lawyers in New York, about $20,000 is realistic in terms of what you could spend. And if people call me and, maybe they don't have enough money for my services, I'm always happy to recommend other people who are still excellent, but, maybe are a little bit less expensive. But what you don't want to do is you really don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish about the prenup, because if you do it incorrectly, it could cause more problems down the line.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If you're balking at the price of that right now, You have no idea what a bargain.
Well, so that's the thing. A divorce, I mean, people do get scared because they think of it as a simple document. I mean, as we were just talking about all the different options that you can do, it's not a simple document. And second, if you get divorced, I mean, my retainer for a divorce is $25,000, and then divorces can be hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're fighting about lots of things. So, do it well and do it right. You don't need to get the most expensive lawyer in town, but you should get a really good, competent lawyer who knows how to draft these agreements. Don't just have, the lawyer who handles everything else for you. Just do it. Right. You want to get somebody who's really experienced in prenups.
You mean don't go to LegalZoom?
It can be problematic because, we do fight in divorces about people who have prenups that are maybe ambiguous or not clear, and then that can create more issues.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, just again, if you're getting married, you need to get a prenup. It will be the single best thing that you do for yourself and for your relationship and everybody involved, rather than skipping this process. Now, let's change gears a little bit and talk about the flip side. Let's talk about the divorce process if someone did not get a prenup, because I think the scenario is kind of implied about what we just referred if they did. But if they didn't, what does that entail and what is that going to look like?
So every divorce is different. Depends on, do you have kids? Do you not have kids? What are your assets? What needs to be valued? Do you have a business? Do you have complicated assets? So a simple divorce, if you don't have children, can be really simple. The best piece of advice that I can give people is to treat the divorce as a business decision as much as possible. We have more trials in divorce cases than in many other areas of law. And I think the biggest reason is that people don't act rationally, which I completely understand. Most people are hurt. A lot of people feel betrayed, and they want to use the divorce process as a way to get justice. Unfortunately, you're not going to feel justice from the divorce process. Judges, especially in New York, see so many cases, see so many people who have gone through difficult situations, so that if, for example, your spouse has cheated on you and you want a court to say he was a bad guy, which again, from an emotional perspective, I understand, you're not going to get that from divorce court. You're just not. They see too much. And all you're going to get is a bunch of lawyers who make a lot of money and less money that you're going to keep. So by keeping it as a business decision and trying to do it as efficiently and amicably as possible, even if you're unbelievably hurt, you're going to be so much better off because you'll get a better deal and there'll be more money within the marriage and within the family for you to divvy up. Does that make sense, Mike?
Yeah. I mean, and it's tough too. Again, if you're the breadwinner in the marriage, as I was, it's really difficult because let's say you get separated, and at least in my scenario, tell me if I'm wrong, this has been identical for my friends who've gone through this process as well. I had to pay her a monthly, stipend essentially so she could go get an apartment or live where she wanted to live, to pay her bills and to pay for her divorce attorney for her. And so that's a tough pill to swallow, especially if that drags on, for months and in my case, well over a year. It's brutal.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, there is usually a side who wants it to be done quicker and the other side who doesn't want it to be done as quickly, which does make it difficult. But I always, try to encourage my clients to do it as quickly as they can, with obviously still getting as good of a deal as they can. But generally, it's better for both people for it to drag on. And if, for example, if I was representing your wife, what I would have said to her is, we can drag this out, which might be good in the short run because he'll pay your expenses. But if you just come to him right away and ask for more money up front, he's probably going to be a lot more generous than after a year when he spent X dollars on legal fees for both sides and he's fought for so long. So that's a win-win for both of you, right? Because you'll spend less overall and she'll get more. Yeah,
absolutely. How long does a divorce typically take? Let's just say not for someone who's crazy wealthy, right? They've got a business that might, make 6 figures a year. Couples maybe 30, early 30s. Is this a $100,000 deal over 6 months? And I know a lot of it, this can be done very quickly. It can be done in a week, right? If both parties want to get it done and come to terms. But I would just say in your experience, on average, what should people expect?
So I know it's such a lawyerly answer to say it depends, but it really does depend. If people are both really motivated to get it done, getting an agreement done within, let's say, 2 or 3 months is really quick. And then, of course, it takes the court another, say, 3 to 6 months to process everything. If you're divorced within 6 months after you decide, then you've done a really good job. On the other side, it can last much longer than that. And you said $100,000. If people are amicable and reasonable, the whole thing can cost, within that $25,000 retainer or even less. And it depends on how many, do you have children? So once you have children, then of course you open into the custody issues and the child support issues, which just opens up the plane of what you're talking about. But, if you're going to be amicable about anything, I recommend being amicable and cooperative about issues regarding your children, because the best outcomes for kids from divorce are when their parents are not fighting. It's not about being divorced that makes the difference for kids. It's about how the parents treat each other both before the divorce and after the divorce. And I'm not a psychological expert, but I've read enough studies, just in tangent to my main job to understand that. So I always try to encourage people to be amicable where the kids are concerned. But if you have a custody battle, that can be hundreds of thousands of dollars easily.
Yeah, agreed. That's the one thing that we were fortunate in my scenarios is our marriage was very short and it was very amicable. So from a parenting perspective, there was never any issues or drama there, which is really helpful. And we've got a phenomenally happy kid now these days.
That's
a great relationship, sure. So, my friend uses the term weaponize, and he's like, man, just don't ever weaponize your kids and use them as a tool to, get revenge on your spouse or throw them under the bus or anything like that. So I would recommend that as well to anybody.
Yeah, no, and those are always the toughest cases. And there's not much legally that we can do if parents are, saying bad things about each other or putting the kids in the middle. There's not much that a judge can do. A lot of those things are best handled therapeutically. There's not much that the legal system can do if parents are just behaving really badly, but the only victims there are the kids, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alyssa, this has really been a really educational call. I've never had a conversation outside of my own personal experience on this topic, especially for other people who are going to have a chance to learn from this. Are there any other parts to this process that you feel are really critical to know about that we have not covered?
I think just in general to become educated about the issues in your state. So again, divorce law is so state specific. So I've done a lecture before that we call Smart Women Plan Ahead. And it's not just geared towards women. I just happened to do it for female audiences about, whether you're single, whether you're happily married, or whether you're contemplating a divorce. What are just the basics about divorce law that you should know? Because maybe, not everybody has a prenup. Maybe you're married already and you don't have a prenup. But significant things still happen in your life during your marriage. And by educating yourself about them, you can still protect yourself even without a prenup. So, for example, each state has different rules about what's separate property. In New York, if you receive an inheritance during your marriage, it's your separate property. If you keep it in your sole name and you don't mix it in with marital money. But not everybody knows that. So it's fine if you want to make your inheritance your marital property, but my point is to do it knowingly so that you don't come to a divorce lawyer's office 5 years later and you're kicking yourself because you're, say, the non-moneyed spouse, but you've now just given a gift to your spouse of half of your inheritance. So things like that. My advice is get educated, talk to somebody who knows it, just Google it, understand what the laws are in your state so that if, God forbid, the situation arises, you have made major decisions smartly. It doesn't mean you're divorce planning. It doesn't mean that you're socking money away or plotting. That's not at all what I'm advocating. I'm just advocating everyone knowing the basics so that when big things happen, like leaving a job, like getting an inheritance or a gift from your family, you decide whether you want to make that separate or marital property, and you decide that the knowing risks you're taking if you're leaving your job, because what are the maintenance laws in your state, meaning alimony? So that's my advice. Just, go in with knowledge.
Absolutely. And I would have to say that if you're, making 7 figures a year, if you've got a net worth in the 7-figure or higher arena, that the other attorney you need to call at the same time around the prenup is most likely your estate planner, correct?
Absolutely. We did not touch on the fact that what a prenup also does is, as I said in the very beginning, protect against death. So prenups are not a replacement for a will. What we typically do in a prenup is to say whether or not you're you're waiving your right of election. So what that means is, as soon as you get married, you have the right to X percentage of your spouse's estate. It varies state by state. So in New York, you can't disinherit your spouse. If you don't leave your spouse at least a third, your spouse can go to court and ask for that third. That applies to separate or marital property. It's totally distinct from divorce law, and it applies in New York at least, regardless of how long you've been married. So if I came into my marriage with $1 million, I didn't, but if I did, and my husband came in with nothing, and if on our honeymoon I died, he would off the bat be entitled to $333,000. Now, maybe that's fine. Or maybe it's my second marriage and I have kids from my first marriage and I really want that $1 million to go to them. So that's another thing to think about. And so in a prenup, you can say we're each waiving our right of election. So whatever we do in our will is what matters and what controls. Does that make sense, Mike?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So obviously if someone is listening to this and they're in New York, they can absolutely give you a call if they
Sure.
need either side of this taken care of. For those who do not live in New York, do you offer any kind of help or services or books or courses or anything that would be useful to folks who are listening?
I don't, because my knowledge is really about New York. But even if people wanted to reach out and needed the name of somebody in their state, I do know lots of divorce lawyers in lots of other states. I'm always happy to give a recommendation.
Awesome.
So they can
really generous.
Email me.
Yeah, and what would be the best way for people to connect with you?
By email. My email is alyssa@rowerllc.com.
Okay, awesome. And obviously they can go to your website as well.
Yes, rowerllc.com.
Okay, perfect. Well, Alyssa, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this topic today. It's unbelievably important. I mean, if you're going to get married, typically there's still a 50% chance you're going to end up divorced at this point. And it's one of the most expensive things and just gut-wrenching things you'll ever have to go through. And you can solve all of this and make it infinitely easier on yourself and your spouse by taking care of it in the beginning with a prenup. So I would highly recommend that you follow Alyssas Advice and take advantage of that.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's been really fun being on your show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I appreciate it so much. And guys and gals, thanks so much for listening as always. And we'll see you on the next episode. Take care.